I'm Matt Garnier. Pause between the M's. I'm Matt Garnier, formerly the host of the Liberty Way podcast, which I'd like to remind everybody was never endorsed by or endorsing of Liberty University. However, I'd like to thank all the good people there who supported the show, and I hope you'll stick around with me. To those of you who put a gag order on any formal acknowledgement of our existence, you're welcome for the undue attention. It is time to start something brand new. This is InTerminable. And my guest today is James Lindsay, who was part of the Grievance Studies Affair, of which I spoke about with Peter Boghossian in an interview which is now published on blessjerry.com, so you can go check that out. James Lindsay has also done a lot of work and writing on the topic of critical social justice, postmodernism, commentary on all that sort of thing, identity politics, and everything that leads to. I strongly recommend checking out the video by Mike Nana, the documentarian, called Postmodern Religion and the Faith of Social Justice. That is a great intro to their work. And let me tell you, if you think that a pandemic is isolating, try being a martyr for the integrity of academic scholarship. James Lindsay can tell you a thing or two about that. I loved having this talk with him. He is a brilliant guy. You should follow him at Conceptual James on Twitter. And please enjoy the first InTerminable podcast with James Lindsay. James Lindsay, comically large swordsman. I'm thrilled to have you on the podcast here.
I'm thrilled to be here.
That one really cracked me up. I do love your use of the insults in your Twitter name, but that one was one of my favorites.
Yeah, that was a good one. I did move on, but maybe I should move back at some point.
Low-level hoaxer now, I see.
No, I changed it again today.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I was a low-level hoaxer, and now somebody made fun of me for making a Lord of the Rings reference yesterday. So now I'm also known as Aragorn. Just kidding, I'm Frodo.
People love to go after a nerd. Do you identify as a Lord of the Rings nerd, fantasy nerd?
I am a Lord of the Rings nerd and fan, but the funny reality here is that the metaphor that Tolkien was actually making with the One Ring, it wasn't, of course, he wasn't talking about intersectionality, which is what I refer to, but he was talking about this kind of central planning, misuse of power kind of thing, that you think you can take a thing and control it, that you can't actually control. And so the metaphor is actually sort of apt. But people decided not people. People loved it. Person decided that needed to be made fun of.
Yeah, good distinction to make.
They also, I don't think the person has any clue, because they describe me as like Southern Baptist Aragorn. And it's like, no.
Yeah, you can't count on these types to be especially nuanced in their thinking, but it does make for some good
just
content.
Make it up.
Yeah.
Just make it up and go.
I gotta say, I think you were one of the most likable guys ever to appear on the Joe Rogan Experience.
Really?
Yeah, I really think that the general impression was that you don't take yourself too seriously.
No, not usually.
In spite of, your work is completely serious, albeit veiled with a certain amount of comedy. You don't perceive that in yourself, though?
I do. It's really funny because I know the work that I'm doing is, I'm willing to actually say, deadly serious. It is extremely serious, the things that I'm analyzing, and why truth and methodology and ultimately what we're really looking at, if we want to fly all the way out to the moon and look at it biggest picture, is conflict resolution systems. That's really, really important, and it has to be taken seriously. And the corruption of academia is a very serious problem. The corruption leaking into culture and informing how we organize our society is very, very important. The ability for this to take over individuals and create this very toxic, polarized socio-political environment is very toxic. So this is all super serious. But if you can't, it's like the person at the middle of it doesn't really matter. And so that's where you shouldn't take yourself seriously. So I do actually try. I have this weird thing where it's like people are all the time asking me, what do you want to be known as? And it's like, I'd rather be known kind of as, not quite as a comedian, but like if I had to be known for one thing, if I had to choose between smart and funny, it would be funny for sure.
Yeah. I remember you said something along those lines to Bridget Fedezi. It might've been last year, but I was wondering what you meant by that. You said that you would rather lean towards comedy as an instrument, I guess, to do the serious work. Like, what's kind of the inspiration there and the ideal in terms of how that would manifest for you?
Well, I like to laugh. I mean, that's really at the bottom of it. It's a lot of this stuff, and it's actually a good thing that you're bringing this up for me right now, because I've kind of lost sight of the humor in the stuff I'm doing. I do manage to, crack jokes at it or laugh at it or parody it and whatnot to some degree still. But if you kind of can step back from how serious it is, this stuff's actually really funny. And I've always, I grew up where it was all like, how do you make the joke? What's the joke to make? We're all a group of friends, hanging out, growing up together, all guys, trying to prank each other, trying to joke with each other. And it's just, I'm always kind of happiest when we're looking for not the way to like cut other people down, make fun of stuff, but to make fun of stuff, not people. Right. And so making fun of stuff, I just love to do. It's making things fun. And I try to have a really good time with that. And I think it's really, a place where I become happy. But making fun of people, I'm not really all that down with. That's kind of, not where it goes. And I think comedy actually can really cut into that pretty well. I don't want to be a stand-up guy, or anything like that, but I do like to try to come up with witty ways to look at things and things that make me laugh, and share the things that make me laugh and frame things in ways that I hope make other people laugh. I've noticed that my jokes tend to go over people's heads a lot of time though, and that's probably not that good.
Well, it might just mean you have a good dry wit,
It's dry. I always like to tell people that, if you complain about my dry wit, you couldn't handle my wet wit. But
I've always been a big advocate, though, that comedy and the serious work go hand in hand. It's not like you have to step aside from really meaningful stuff to, give yourself a break or just indulge in a laugh. Like the two work together, and the intelligence is kind of streamlined there, I think.
Yeah, Bridget and I actually have a kind of like meeting of minds that's pretty profound on the level of understanding that you can do serious work without taking yourself seriously in the middle of it. And the second that you start taking yourself too seriously is the second that you're, on the road to, I don't know if ruin is right, but it's something like that. That pomposity is just not necessary. And in fact, it's counterproductive in the long run. So I strongly try to avoid taking myself too seriously, even though the work is very, very serious and very important.
So if I can take kind of a roundabout way to talking about the inquiries and scholarship that you've done, I want to talk about how you got into studying religious belief on your own. I mean, I guess you got your doctorate in math first, but then you chose to study religion.
Correct.
What led you to do that?
Religion.
Growing up on it.
Well, growing up with it, it's almost like, speaking of comedy, it's like I'm coming out here in a torn t-shirt and say, well, I grew up Catholic. It's true though. I grew up Catholic in a overwhelmingly Southern Baptist region. So, there's already these weird, experiences that you have with anywhere you have two religious cultures clashing and that you end up in the middle of it. It's a weird experience. So, the Southern Baptists are not particularly big fans of the Roman Catholics. I figure you might know that. And so, I grew up thinking, I go to church or whatever with a family. It's a whole thing. Okay, Christian something, kid, you don't know the difference. And then it's like all the other kids that call themselves Baptists and I don't even really know what that is because church is Catholic and I don't really know what's going on. All them, they're like throwing stuff at us and calling us Mary worshipers and all this crap. I had no idea what was going on. And so then I kind of grew up, with this kind of weird perspective on religion because I was part of what I identified as a Christian belief system that wasn't recognized as a Christian belief system by the clear, as I would phrase it now, Christian hegemony around me. And so that, so that's a weird stage. And ultimately, of course, I don't know if a lot of people know this. I was actually the chaplain of a campus organization for 3 years while I was in college. I, for that organization, hosted Bible studies. My best friend was pretty seriously Presbyterian. I don't actually know the specific denomination of the guy who hosted the Bible studies, but I went to all of them, and they were probably Southern Baptist. Looking back at it now, I still don't actually know what the guy was, but he came in and did a Bible study with our group every week or twice a week, I think. And so, I mean, I got very into trying to figure it all out, and I was always trying to figure out kind of what I was very interested in kind of studying comparative religion. And, I had this idea, like, there are probably deep human truths here, and all of the religions kind of probably look at the same human truth, but I don't know what it is. And I wanted to try to figure it out, so much so that I actually undertook a project that I began my senior year in college to rewrite the New Testament as a kind of, taking the specific Christian context out of it and trying to explain it more in terms of what would have been kind of like cheap psychological philosophy or something. I don't know, very metaphorical kind of stuff. And then that eventually started to turn into after I finished my PhD and I had time to focus on things that weren't mathematics, that turned into a more serious inquiry. During my master's degree, though, I was actually, again, was invited to a group, not a campus group, but invited to a philosophical group that met off campus. It had nothing to do with campus. It was all like grown-ups, frankly, people in their 50s and 60s. They'd host this really nice dinner once every other week, and we'd have these conversations. And it was supposed to be about philosophy, but we usually ended up mostly talking about God and what does God mean. And there were pastors and priests and things of different denominations there, very kind of interfaith. And, we'd have these really in-depth discussions, like 3-4 hours a night. It was really a fascinating experience. And I brought a really weird perspective to the table that they really liked. So they kept inviting me back. So eventually I ended up wanting to understand why it is that people believe what they believe with religion. And that's what got me into studying religious psychology and really digging into it.
Were you one of those kids who ruminates on deep existential topics from
Yeah.
an early age?
Well, that while telling, fart jokes, but,
Yeah.
On the other side. So a little bit of both of those things. So it's like what became really apparent to me in the early 2010s was that, as part of the atheist movement that was going on, and it was very clear to me that there was a massive disconnect in communication here where the religious people and the atheist people were not agreeing on what the word God means. So I kind of went back to this deeper, older interest that I had, going back to when I was thinking, I'll rewrite the New Testament. No, no arrogance here. I'll just rewrite the Gospels, no problem. And I read the thing like 7-8 times to be able to. So I'm actually quite familiar, or was. I'm not as sharp. Like I couldn't tell you which book is what anymore, like I could back in the day. But I used to be quite familiar with the New Testament. And shocking how many Christians think they are and just don't know what the heck they're talking about. But I kind of went back to that deeper thing where I was going to try to explain what God means in terms that atheist people could understand, and maybe that could start facilitating a more productive conversation. But then the social justice movement destroyed the atheist movement from within, and I ended up turning all of my attention to social justice, which I also recognized because of all the psychology of religion and moral psychology I was studying to be a kind of quasi-religious movement in development.
Yeah. So was the thought behind kind of doing this revision of the New Testament, like get to an actual agreeable truth about it, or get it to be viewed like through a practical lens? Like, here's what you can glean from it, regardless of what the inherent truth is.
I mean, at the time when I was like in my early 20s, I would say, because I certainly was still a believer in God, but definitely not properly Christian anymore.
Okay.
By that point. I would say that I was trying to get to points that you might consider to be truth within the category of wisdom rather than truth within the category of knowledge, if we were to separate the two.
Yeah.
And I figured that the New Testament is actually loaded with a lot of it. There's actually a great deal of wisdom contained in that set of books, really is the best way to look at it. And I wanted to be able to I had actually taken a deep dive in studying both Buddhism and Taoism, and I really wanted to try to understand. It's like I saw so many parallels. It's like they're talking about some of the different things in different ways with some of the same stuff and some of the same ways, some of the same principles. So I wanted to figure out what that underlying wisdom was. I would have been more interested in wisdom at the time when I looked at religion. In fact, I would have said at the time that science is the province of knowledge and religion is the province of wisdom. And that those things are related, of course, but they're not quite the same thing.
So were you especially hung up on the deity of Christ, or that was secondary?
I mean, growing up Catholic, I don't think I ever really knew what that meant.
Okay.
It's a thing where you look at all the crosses, stations of the cross, and like it's hanging on the wall, but
yeah,
it's just Bible stories or something. The Catholic faith is, I mean, I don't want to insult Catholics who are quite serious about it, but the Catholic faith is not organized so intensely around that. I mean, it's obviously central, but at the same time, it's like if I were to compare Protestantism to Catholicism from kind of an inside perspective where I've had a foot in both experiences, Protestants are really, really interested in the deity of Christ, the divinity of Christ, and the grace that is extended through the atonement and his sacrifice. Whereas Catholics are like, be a member of the church in good standing and do the things that Catholics tell you to do. And that's enough. That's good to go. And so it's like, you don't really focus on talking about things like grace or salvation or really any of that. You go to church, you sing the songs, you show up every time that you're supposed to show up. You go to confession, you tell the guy what you did, you do your penance so that you can burn off purgatory time or whatever it's for. And there are various obligations that you keep. And if you just do all that, it's all good. It's like it's been so systematized that it's like removed from the thing that it actually is supposed to be speaking to. It's really kind of it makes sense from my perspective, like why the Reformation happened, besides the indulgences and all the mafia level stuff that was going on at the time. It makes sense why a Reformation would have happened. And at the same time, it makes sense why the Catholic thing would have so much staying power, even in spite of it, because it's so clearly systematized. It's actually quite simple to go to heaven. In Catholicism, you just stay in good with the church, more or less, and then at the end of the day, everybody's going to purgatory, so then you do whatever you have to do there, and then you're good to go. And so it's very systematic. You don't actually have to know what's in the Bible actually is very much felt like very much like an afterthought.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, it seems to sort of fit an inherent, deeply wired need for predictability, which, like, if you have OCD, I mean, Catholicism makes a certain amount of sense, like where rituals would come from,
right?
To some extent,
I mean, there's even an OCD that's caused by Catholicism that I think is relevant to the social justice stuff. It's called scrupulosity.
I remember Helen Plucker was talking about that.
Yeah. I've working in the atheist movement. I actually got to know a few victims of scrupulosity, and it's a fascinating problem.
I was definitely afflicted with that.
Well, I don't know. Did you come in a Calvinist tradition?
No, it was, they claim to be non-denominational, but
okay.
all of the pillars of what kind of guidelines for here's what you have to do in order to determine your eternal fate were still there. I mean, I could have found that more or less on my own, and I was going to give it the most literal reading to try to give myself a predictable order.
Yeah. It's really common apparently in Catholics, Mormons, and Calvinists, but more or less no other Christians have a really strong bent towards scrupulosity.
Yeah.
Maybe if you start getting into like the Adventists and these kind of like other groups, but I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't follow it too much.
I imposed on myself the most rigid interpretation of anything because the stakes felt too high to do otherwise. So more of a personality thing than maybe the particular denomination or creed or anything like that.
Right. So from the stuff I do now, I would say that what's called critical whiteness studies, which is like Robin DiAngelo's white fragility, that's straight up scrupulosity. It's very obvious race scrupulosity.
Oh, the parallels definitely are obvious.
I think masculinity studies is probably mostly scrupulosity among certain kinds of men, but not entirely. It's not as neat and clean. Whiteness studies is virtually certainly scrupulosity about race going ape shit.
Scrupulosity meaning like that there's a distinct set of rules about how you follow it, or what do you mean?
Scrupulosity in the sense that, I mean, it's a sense of OCD and paranoia around not having been sufficiently holy. So maybe there are these rules that you have to follow in order to do it, which is the OCD version. But there's also this kind of deep-seated paranoia that comes with believing yourself not to have been successfully saved because you didn't do it right.
Yes.
And
Okay.
right. And so the sin here, actually depravity here is privilege. And which is the depravity meaning the want to sin. And so the depravity in the heart of whiteness studies is white privilege. And so there's this, like, I mean, it's Lady Macbeth trying to wash the stain out, but the stain is being who you are. Wanting to sin would be in the religious context, and then being white would be in the whiteness context, where you have ultimately, Robin DiAngelo, for example, author of White Fragility, gets asked, what do you see yourself as trying to do? And she says she's trying to be less white.
So why do you think people see the need to cleanse themselves of these sins? Is that part of the meaning structure that's wired in, or is it somehow a protective mechanism that they have for some wider reason?
I hate to guess at people's motivations since I'm not a psychologist to diagnose that kind of thing. But my best guess is that they detect it in themselves. They know it's bad, and it's actually a small number. Proportionally speaking, it's a small number of people who can't resolve the conflict. So, for example, with religion, you might have people who, maybe they have that wandering eye and they're checking everybody out and they're saying, oh, that person's hot, I'd like to have sex with that person or whatever. And then they're like, lust. And then, better to poke out your own eye. And so then they're trying to purge themselves of that. And then you end up with stuff like the Scarlet Letter. And then on the other hand, you have, in this case, people, I very, very strongly suspect that the impulse underneath a lot of whiteness studies is that you have people who, whether it's implicit biases or whether it's how they were raised or whether it just is how they are or whatever it happens to be, they notice race. So they walk down the street and they're like, oh, there's a black person there. And then they're like, it's not that they freak out that there's a black person. They freak out that they noticed that the person was black.
Right.
I'm not supposed to notice. I'm a racist. And so then they go write 10,000 words about how color blindness is the wrong approach. And, and because it's the thing they can't achieve.
Right. And then project that onto everyone else as if to
Correct.
say how everyone feels. So
not a big Jungian, but what Jung called shadow projection for sure. It's like a small proportion of people don't know how to handle the conflict of being human and things happening that are, in your head that are like moral transgressions. They don't even have to happen outside of your head, but then you've experienced this moral transgression that you perceive in your head and you freak out about it, about having done that. So, I mean, and again, I don't want to put Robin DiAngelo down or on the spot, but if you read White Fragility, she actually tells a lot of stories, and she tells at least 2 or 3 stories where it's like, well, that's definitely what's going on. It's like one of the stories she tells is she's at this work potluck and it's at the park, I think, and she's been invited, and there are 2 groups, and she gets out of her car with her food, I suppose, and there are 2 groups there. One is the work group and one is like this group of all black people maybe having a family reunion or whatever they're doing. And she expresses how she had this moment of just absolute freaking out that she might have to be in the all black group. And it's like, lady, that ain't normal. And then you felt the need to write that in your book.
Yeah, it's like, this overcompensation.
That ain't normal. It's like, we can see what's going on here. And so, if we look back, if we're talking philosophy, we can look back to Nietzsche. Nietzsche said that a lot of the philosophers aren't really doing philosophy. Maybe he's talking about himself here too, which is really funny. They're just, they're rationalizing their own pathologies through their philosophy. Right. And then that turns into the ways that people live. And Nietzsche probably was just as bad as anybody about that, and which is kind of funny. And then you can see it everywhere. It's like we're talking about projection or shadow projection, if you will, where people are trying to rationalize their own, as they perceive them, moral failures and give explanation to them and then write them down as systems. And here we go.
Yeah.
White fragility.
I do wonder where the line is in terms of how much do they believe their own shit at what point is it a protective mechanism that they projected onto other people?
So, at one point, and I think of this all the time, at one point, Christopher Hitchens, a very famous atheist character, was asked a question like, how sincere do you think these pastors are? Because do they really believe their own shit?
Right.
And he said that there are, of course, some grifters, but overwhelmingly, and we could name some within Christianity for sure. I mean, it's like a running joke of Joel Osteen, for example. But I wasn't supposed to name any. But the point is, he went on to say the overwhelming majority of these pastors are the most sincere people that he's ever met. Sincerity doesn't, of course, imply being correct, but it does imply having come to believe that. I would honestly guess that Robin DiAngelo fully believes every word she says. Okay. I don't think that she's scamming. I don't think she's a grifter. I think that she has created a very elaborate philosophy that allows her to exist as she is and not hate herself more than necessary for it.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. But maybe a certain amount of self-honesty and even cultural honesty about it could potentially expose that, I would think.
I think it's possible. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say. Whatever's underneath that is, and of course, I don't like to guess at people's psychological motivations, but whatever's underneath that is deep. And the thing is the lesson for the rest of us is we don't have to live in other people's pathologies. We do not have to actually be subject to living in other people's pathologies. Yeah. If they can be identified.
Yeah, and sometimes they organize and they're very easy to identify. I mean, you've literally got academic journals about fat studies, and like within that, if you're part of something like that, like, pardon the joke, but isn't the elephant in the room the fact that nobody actually believes, like, you're churning out articles like about a concept that who knows why you're actually saying it, but like it just seems you would tire of the cognitive dissonance to keep beating away at it.
I think it's the opposite. I think the cognitive dissonance is the fuel. I think that's the gas that goes in their tank. If you take something like fat studies, they're utterly convinced that what actually causes problems for fat people, and they call themselves fat people with a capital F because it's an identity category.
At which point it can be a compliment.
Right. And so they think that the primary problem is that society does not honor and recognize fatness as equally good as everything else, and that these are all socially constructed reasons. There are no real reasons, for example, saying that being overweight, you're not allowed to say overweight because it implies there's a correct weight, by the way. Yep. But being overweight is detrimental to one's health, at least statistically speaking. They're very, very concerned with the ways that those kinds of narratives or patterns of thought contribute to people undervaluing fat people and therefore oppressing them. And so then they write this stuff that's just ridiculous. When it gets made fun of, which it invariably does, they then say, aha, look, even more proof that society hates fat people. And this is super common to a lot of this kind of stuff. It's really pronounced within the social justice movement. I remember there was this comic, I actually have it saved on my phone. I've kept it for years, where it shows a woman wearing like a feminist power shirt, shoveling a huge pile of crap that says opinions on it. And then there's a wall and it says the internet, and it shows her throwing the opinions, the shit opinions over the wall. And then the shit, it shows some shovels and stuff appear above the wall, and the poop is raining back down on her and she's covered in it. And then she's screaming, patriarchy.
Wow.
and it's like, that really catches to the heart of something here. But it's really, really interesting because this is actually directing society at this point. This idea that's so common that we hear now is like, we hear these bad ideas out of, say, switch to critical race theory. It can be fat studies, it can be disability studies. It doesn't matter. But we'll say critical race theory. We hear these terrible ideas, just terrible ideas. Like, we need to set up, this is Ibram Kendi. we need to we have to have an anti-racist constitutional amendment that permanently sets up a government office for anti-racism. And part of its task is going to be to decide which legislation is racist and therefore make that racist legislation unconstitutional. And how do you tell if it's racist by its impact? This is a terrible idea. It's just nobody who understands civics would go along with this idea. It has nothing to do with racism or black people. It has nothing to do with any of it. And you say, that's a terrible idea. And they say, you just don't want black people to have equality, is the comeback. And it's like, it's that comic every time. It's just unbelievable. But this is kind of the weird self-fulfilling, or it's not self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like it is and it isn't. It's more of like a self-creating monster. Where it says it puts out terrible ideas about whether it's obesity or whatever. And then when people criticize it, the criticism isn't able to possibly be understood in terms of the idea being bad, because that's not possible. It has to be understood in terms of the person having hateful motivations against the people making the claim. And it's a very bizarre thing that this is so effective.
Yeah. But it fits into everything you've been saying about social justice being, or at least following the patterns of religion. And you've said that it arranges things so that it can treat its beliefs as knowledge. And this is something that I kind of talked to Peter Boghossian about too. And he calls social justice the new religion. Like it treats its own rules as absolute to sometimes an even greater extent than traditional religious ideology. Like as soon as it comes up with some kind of rule or something to impose, it treats it as indisputable, So like, are they basically trying to say you think that their own laws are set in stone because society creates truth, or by virtue of the fact that they are displacing longer held institutions, are they admitting that neither one is absolute? Like, what's the right way to deal with this?
So that's a deep question that gets right to the heart of their mindset, and it's very difficult to understand. The way that they actually think this is very difficult to communicate. The way that they actually think is that knowledge, this is the cornerstone. Knowledge is ultimately socially constructed. In other words, knowledge is a political project. How does knowledge work? People who have power in society become authenticated, say by getting a PhD or something like that, or becoming appointed to a policy team or whatever. People become authenticated to decide what is and is not true. That decision-making process is social, therefore inherently political. Therefore, the determination of which ideas are true and false is a political decision. Whether or not they're actually corresponding to reality, as summarizes Foucault's point, Michel Foucault, the postmodern philosopher, misses the point. It doesn't matter. They could be statements that we consider to be true, they could be false, but either way, it doesn't actually matter, because what matters is that they are a means of politics. That's the thing to focus on. So their worldview begins with understanding that because the processes that lead to people having knowledge are essentially social, and that politics influences all social processes, all knowledge is actually a political product. So therefore, all things have to be analyzed in terms of politics, their political valence. What they've decided is the one thing that's basically indisputable is one's own experience.
Yeah.
And in particular, the only thing they care about is the experience of power in society. They don't care about whether you had a good time out the park. They care about your experience of systems of power, as they call them, in society. And so that experience, the lived experience, is considered to be the only real thing. Okay, so we're in a radically subjectivist.
Yeah, can we pause on that for a second, though? Because it feels like what they're doing is they've Trojan horsed this term lived experience to conflate it with the narrative about lived experience.
Yes, yeah, that's the next part.
Okay.
Exactly. It is exactly right. That is exactly right. Because they also have a belief, their theory of mind, if you want to go that far into it, is actually, and this is again confusing, but it is actually that there is a true consciousness and a false consciousness of your experience of power. So if you are a, say, white person, therefore you're a person that exists within a milieu of dominance, there is a true experience of that, which would be that you recognize that you are racist, you recognize that you're complicit, etc. And then there's a false consciousness one, which is called internalized dominance or internalized whiteness sometimes, where you think that it's natural, that it's normal, it's a part of being individual, that people can just be who they are, and so on and so forth. And so there's this false consciousness versus a true consciousness. And wouldn't you know it, their theory tells you what true consciousness looks like and has carefully laid out how all the other false consciousnesses work. Therefore, when I say that lived experience is the one true thing, lived experience itself is only true when it agrees with theory. Otherwise, it is false consciousness. It is somebody misinterpreting what they actually went through. So this is why, for example, if you want a concrete example of this happening, this is why, for example, there are social work at the state level. There are states whose social work policy now is that when you enter into a situation where you are talking to, say, a homeless white person, one of the first things, if not the first thing you're supposed to discuss with them is the role of white privilege. And if you enter into the home, and this is, in fact, I know even in not just a few states, but this is in many states. So you're a social worker, you have a problem case, you go into the problem case's home, you talk to them, and it's a racial minority, and you have to ask them, what role do you think racism plays in getting you to the problems that you have? And if they say little to none, you need to now educate them on how they've experienced racism, because they have false consciousness about their experience of being a racial minority. Or if they're a homeless white person, they have false consciousness called internalized dominance about their status as a privileged person, and because they get to believe that they're downtrodden, seeing as they're homeless. And so they have defined what is the correct interpretation of one's lived experience of power in all cases.
Right. Such that it's irrefutable from one given perspective.
Exactly. So you have a radically subjectivist approach. Lived experience is knowledge. Knowledge is just politics. So all knowledges are on the same footing as politics. Okay. Lived experience is true. It's true knowledge because it's lived experience of the political circumstances, but it's only correctly interpreted if it agrees with social justice theory. That's actually how they think. That is, I'm not exaggerating. I'm not making it up. That's actually how
theory
they think.
Is the new knowledge.
It is very hard to understand that they really are coming from this perspective. And so then the last layer to it is, if that's the case, then you have a new metric that determines not truth and falsity anymore, because those miss the point, but when an idea is valid or invalid. And an invalid idea is one that's problematic, and a valid idea is one that leads toward liberation, disruption of entrenched systems, dismantling of systems of power, subversion of hegemonic forces, and so on. So what that ultimately boils down to is, if in science, let me draw it this way. In science, if you have a conflict of ideas, you put forward your hypothesis about how water works in some situation, I put forth mine. How do we resolve it? We go look at water under those circumstances and then let the evidence determine it, right? In social justice, that's not how they do it. Somebody puts forth an idea, somebody else puts forth an idea. The person who wins is the person who has the greater claim on oppression.
Right.
In particular, oppression based on that idea. And so they have a method, what we would call this, in kind of thinking about it in terms of epistemology, what we could say is it's like they have a positive epistemology, which is in science forwarding a hypothesis. Maybe the hypothesis comes out of theory, maybe it doesn't, but we forward a hypothesis. And they have a negative aspect of epistemology, which cuts down bad ideas. It's called falsification. In social justice, the positive aspect is lived experience, and the negative aspect is called problematizing. And so they winnow down knowledge that has to agree with theory, because otherwise it would be problematic. And so in that way, what they've done is they've literally subverted the way that we validate statements. Whether they're true or false doesn't matter. All that matters is whether or not they cause or liberate from oppression. And that's genuinely how they think. The parallel to this is actually very strongly religious.
Yeah.
Because in religion, before we had the Reformation, before the Enlightenment took place, the question, and even after, to a lot of degree, sorry, religious folks, but it's true. One of the key questions for whether or not an idea is valid or blasphemy or heresy is, does it comport with God's law? Does it comport with the word of God? And if it does, then it's true. And if it does not, then it's heretical or blasphemous. And whether true or false doesn't matter. All that matters is whether or not it is valid under that paradigm. And I say that this is very similar to religion, because in religion, what God's word is not secular law, but moral law.
So who creates the canon for the social justice movement?
And in social justice, it is moral law that decides. Problematic is about moral law. It is a system of moral law that they no longer does the secular law, which relies on reasonable person standards and rule of law and due process. Those things are just there to prop up the patriarchy and the white supremacy. Those things are not liberatory. Those don't matter. All that matters is, where are the problematics, whose feelings are being hurt, what are the traumas that are caused or harms that are being caused by it. And so they have forwarded a moral law that, if you want to really put it in really bold terms, and I'm starting to develop these ideas. So this is kind of at the edge of stuff I'm thinking. But in religion, it's like, in Christianity specifically, it's, will this lead towards salvation or away from it? And in critical social justice, it's, will this lead toward liberation from oppression in the material world, or will it keep us in bondage? So the parallelism is so profound. It's salvation replaced with liberationism, that they're virtually identical structures.
Yeah. Liberation from guilt, if nothing else, right? That would be one form of the liberation.
Well, they're only worried about liberation from oppression as they invent oppression.
But those who are not oppressed need a way to take on that grievance or that.
Definitely. They're trying to resolve their guilt. And then that's also problematic, because it turns them into a good white who has resolved their guilt and who has standing. And so that's problematic. And it's a downward spiral for anybody who is trapped in the depravity cycle of privilege.
So then would you say that they're looking to academia as their scripture, or they have to have something on which to kind of to point to, the way religion points to God or its prophets?
Yep.
So is that why you dabbled in the academic journal as kind of a starting point to prove that?
That was exactly why. As a matter of fact, I don't know if Peter told you that when you talked to Peter, but Peter, there's this kind of fateful story where all this came from one kind of fateful conversation that Peter and I had on the phone in probably 2013 or 14. And so I, at the time, was researching for my book that was trying to explain the nature of God in psychological terms. It's called Everybody is Wrong About God. Notice everybody means everybody. It doesn't mean Christians. It doesn't mean Muslims. It doesn't mean atheists. It means everybody. And so I'm working on this book talking about the psychology of religion. Peter ended up having a event with the rather famous skeptic and magician Penn Jillette. And he had a conversation with Penn, and Peter said, somehow they got talking about feminism or gender studies or something like that. And Peter said, don't you think that the academic literature for gender studies works exactly the same way as the Bible works for Christians? And Penn was like, I don't know what you're talking about. That's academic literature. It's a totally different thing. And so Pete gets done with this thing and he calls me frantic. I remember where I was standing in my driveway outside, like trying to clean up pine needles or something, when he called me. And I'm like talking to him, standing there in the driveway. And he's like, all right, I'm going to throw this at you. Tell me if I'm crazy. Just tell me if I'm crazy. And he tells me the story. And he's like, so do you think gender studies, the academic literature in gender studies, works like the Bible for feminism or whatever it is? And I was like, yes, obviously. You're not crazy. You're exactly right. And everybody thought Pete was absolutely nuts for this observation. And I was like, and what's more? And I start telling him about the book I'm writing. And he's like, holy crap, and this is where we suddenly started to realize the parallelism between what was social justice as it was arising in the atheism movement. Like I said, it was happening there big time, starting at probably 2008 and really hit a crescendo by 2011. So it was a kind of ahead of society by 5 or 6 years at least. So we were talking about what we were observing there, and all of a sudden it's like all these pieces started to fit together. And so I finished my book, and it talks about that aspect to some degree. And then Peter and I ended up started trying to figure out, well, is gender studies a religion? And we decided that kind of in the long tradition of hoaxes on theology journals, where people would just publish ridiculous theological claims, and they're like, oh yeah, well, okay, that maybe. And then of course, following after Alan Sokol, we figured, because it's clearly like these jargony words, they can't possibly know what they're talking about. Like, why don't we hoax them? Why don't we? You can't beat a religious canon by arguing against it. It's not possible.
Exactly.
The whole point is that it's intertextually sealed. You cannot argue against scripture and defeat it. So what can you do? You have to expose that it's scripture. So that was actually the deep motivation behind doing the academic papers that came to be called the Grievance Studies Affair in the first place.
I love how dramatically all of it unfolded. I'll definitely link to Mike Nana's videos on that, because it's cool just watching the process from like the idea hitting you to when they finally get accepted, obviously. And it's no small deal that really happened, you know?
It was a thing.
So, I mean, looking back on it now, do you feel like the net gain and loss justifies having done it? Anything you would do differently? I mean,
there's always stuff that we would do differently. Peter likes to focus on the fact that we had one real scholar, and that person basically was invincible, because, you know, you publish this crazy paper and then somebody maybe gets suspicious of it, and then all it takes is a Google search, and then, oh, well, he's a real professor somewhere. And so somebody, you know, people they sent him emails asking him, what the heck, what's happened to you? Are you crazy? Have you lost your mind? But we told him, you know, he's a friend of ours. So we were like, don't answer any of the emails. He's like, I'm not getting involved. So he didn't answer any of the emails, and we just didn't answer any emails that people sent us asking questions about it. And they're like, well, crazy professors are everywhere. And so then we had to make up a bunch of professors, because we only had one friend that was willing to risk his name. And also we weren't exactly telling people that we were doing it. Very, very secretive about it. And so we made up this one character, and I think this is actually kind of a superficial do something different point. We made up this one character, Helen Wilson, who wrote the dog park paper, the dog humping paper. And we gave her a PhD in feminist studies, and those basically don't exist. And so it was very easy for journalists who got suspicious to figure out that something was probably fishy happening there. Had we given her a PhD in gender studies, we probably would have had several more months to have been able to continue perpetrating our investigation. So, you know, there's that. I think if we had some stuff to do differently, I think we would have probably been much more clear about the way that academic hoaxing didn't succeed. I don't think that message got across. Everybody just assumed it was a hoax, and I can understand why. But what we did was something significantly different, and it doesn't seem to have been successfully communicated. Maybe the video of us laughing our asses off when reading through the paper and the comments and things like that, you know, it's all really funny, so it's hard not to. But maybe that gave the wrong impression that it was all just some kind of a joke.
Because people think a joke implies just a joke, but it's obviously so much more.
Yeah, there was a lot more going on there. And in fact, what we did, and nobody really appreciates it, is, you know, we started off with the hypothesis that they would accept hoaxes. And we started, that was in August. And by November, that was in 2017, we decided that hoaxes aren't possible. I kept a diary while we were doing it, and I went back and read the diary a couple months ago, and it's just astonishing. The part through late November to the middle or end of December where I'm personally grappling with the fact that hoaxes didn't work, and we have to do something different, and people won't understand it because it's not hoaxes. And we have to admit that we were wrong, that hoaxes would work, because hoaxes won't work. And it's like, eventually I'm just gonna have to publish my diary, I think. But it's like 40,000 words. I don't know if anybody really wants to read that much crap.
Why not?
So, and some of it's like, it's not bad. It's not like, oh, I'd be embarrassed to have it out there. It's just like inside baseball that's not really interesting.
But when you suggest that the hoaxes didn't work, what do you, I mean, obviously some of them got published. You mean
no, none of those got published. None of the ones that were straight up hoaxes got published. With the fun, speaking of my diary, with the funny exception I wrote in the diary that we only had one paper. Is like at one point it's like we have to rewrite every paper we've tried or throw them away because what we've done so far will not work. It's absolutely wrong. It won't work. And so with the exception of one paper that's just too crazy to have any chance, and that was a dog paper. The dog humping paper was actually much closer to a proper hoax. But even that, it's like they were warm to the idea, but we ended up, when the peer-reviewed comments came back, Helen ended up massively rewriting it, primarily Helen, massively rewriting it to get it in consistency with I was going to say scripture, with the academic literature. And that was a seriously Freudian accident.
Yeah.
And so even it, got completely retooled. It is not as ridiculous as it started. And so, there's maybe we could conclude there was some susceptibility in that one journal, Gender, Place, and Culture, to hoaxes, but only some. And maybe a lot, since they gave it an award too. But nevertheless, the other papers were actually us taking what we were reading in the academic literature and then mixing it with our own crazy ideas and just trying to, it's like, stretch the boundaries. It's like we kind of knew where the edges were, and we were like, what if we stretch it? Will they still take it? And then what we found out in most cases was that we either hadn't stretched it far enough, or that somebody else had already in the academic literature stretched it further than we did. So it's like, really, we just wrote a bunch of papers that we knew what was wrong with them, but they fit in. And so communicating that point didn't succeed. In fact, there's been a recent academic paper that came out saying that, what we wrote up in the first place was saying, well, the main difference was that we intentionally knew our intentions weren't believing the papers. We said something like, what did we say? We said something like, the main difference between the existing literature and the papers that we submitted is that we knew what we were writing wasn't true. But that's not actually what we should have wrote. What we should have written was, we knew why our papers shouldn't be publishable. We knew why they were methodologically broken. We knew why the logic didn't follow. We knew why somebody who was capable of doing a rigorous analysis would not have accepted that paper as rigorous analysis. And that's a different claim. And if I think we had communicated that better in the first place, then perhaps things would have gone a little differently. So, I mean, most of the things of what would we have done differently, it would have been like communications issues. There's a couple of the papers that I wish we hadn't bothered trying to screw around with. They obviously didn't go anywhere. So,
but I doubt that any of these publications would have argued that their basis for accepting it was that they found it to be true. I mean, there's no way to wipe the egg off of their face. I feel like
that's actually, in fact, we talked about that new academic paper that just came out. That's actually the case that it makes. It says that the paper, in particular, he's talking about the fat bodybuilding paper, should be unretracted because they thought it was good scholarship when they accepted it. And so it should be unretracted.
Okay.
And so the thing is, we made that case too. We said when we went public that, and in fact, I sent a letter to Hypatia and put it on Twitter, so I publicized it even. When we went public, I wrote a letter to Hypatia, but we openly said the papers that we wrote that do not have false data in them should stand. The papers that do have false data have to go. And so the journals should have to maintain them. And so this article that came out last month or the last few weeks argues the same thing. If Fat Studies thought that was a good idea, Fat Studies should stand by it. Of course, the person who wrote it tried to criticize us for thinking, it was all a big joke. But it's like, no, you actually criticized the thing the popular interpretation ran with, which we never wanted to have happen and never believed in the first place. And you have now forwarded basically the same argument we did. And so, we've been invited to write a response. So hopefully, we can do that and it'll get published and we'll see what happens from that.
Okay.
But if no, they're not wiping any egg off of their faces. In fact, what they're trying to do is put their head in the sand and pretend it didn't happen for the most part.
Yeah.
Although a book was published talking about it by a couple of people that we ended up citing in our papers too. A book was published, an academic book, in late or sometime in 2019. And it quotes us rather hilariously. It quotes Helen saying that we suffered so you don't have to. It's Christ-like is our sacrifice. And then it quotes me as saying that the social justice literature is like the nuclear waste of scholarship. And that's in it. I'm so happy that that's in a book. It's like, see, that's funny as hell that they put that stuff in there. That's just funny.
That's a nice little badge of honor. Do you feel like it was a personal sacrifice for you? Because I know Peter suggested that it was pretty costly for him just in terms of like his friends and even his workplace kind of turning on him.
Yeah, my workplace wasn't relevant, but my friends, I exacted a rather heavy toll there. I lost most of my left-leaning friends, including family members that have pretty contentious relationships with now. If they are on the left, they pretty much kind of are like, yeah, what, you lost your mind. And then it was an enormous amount of time to do that. I mean, it's like it kind of redirected the entire course of my life, and it's kind of impossible to say that it's in a direction that's making me happy. It's like, I don't want to read social justice shit all day, every day. I don't enjoy it. I don't find it thrilling. I don't make any money really doing it. So it's like, it hasn't been like net positive in those regards. But at the end of the day, it's like, I still think it needed to be that, or something of similar impact or more impact needed to be done. So I'm glad I did it. But the cost has been real. Yeah, it's like, other than a very small number that are kind of scattered to the winds and various, that don't live around me, basically. So I'm saying, I have very few friends now. It's like not real fun. It's like nobody quite knows what to do with me. So the social cost has been, I didn't think it was that significant at first, but as time has worn on, and I realized, it's like the pandemic has really brought it home, because all these people are like, freaking out, like they don't have a social life and they're melting down and they don't know what to do. And I'm like, my life didn't change.
Yeah.
It's like, it wasn't, I mean, I did have work that I'm not doing now, but because I can't. So because stuff got closed, but so there was some income. But other than a little change to my income, I mean, in like my average day-to-day existence, I got a little bit busier because other people were freer, I guess, and asking me more questions and wanting more content or whatever. But other than that, I was like, I'm watching all these people describe what it's like to suffer in the pandemic. And I'm like, that was my everyday for like the last 2.5 years. It's like, I never go out with my friends ever. I'm not even sure I have any around here anymore.
Wow.
And it's like, the costs have been kind of real. And, it's not I don't think I'm crazy, but the mental cost of reading this like cynical, pessimistic, nasty, race baiting, just awful stuff every day, it's not net good for one's well-being,
I would imagine.
Actually, it's funny because somebody asked me the other day, and I decided the next solo podcast I record is going to be on the topic of how don't I go crazy? How have I kept myself from losing my mind given how much I look at this stuff? And I know the answers. So, but the social costs have been substantial, and that's had, emotional well-being costs associated with it.
Yeah. So have you launched a solo podcast?
Yes and no. I think I'm supposed to say yes. I have a website, New Discourses, and there is a podcast on New Discourses where if I don't want to try to wrangle something into an essay, and people apparently like to listen to stuff, I pick up my microphone and talk to it for, 20 minutes to an hour, hour and a half sometimes, and then more or less put some bumpers on the front and back of it and put it on the internet. And that's it. I don't try very hard. It's not like a formal thing. I definitely don't interview people yet, if I ever will. I just kind of talk to a microphone when it's like easier to talk it out than it is to write it out.
Mm-hmm. Stream of consciousness.
Yeah, sort of.
So I really loved How to Have Impossible Conversations, which you co-authored. And
right.
Are you working on anything else right now?
Well, Cynical Theories is the next book, and it's supposed to be out already, but the pandemic delayed all things. It was supposed to come out on the 5th. So now it's coming out on the 25th of August.
And was that a partnership with Helen Pluckrose?
That's correct. And so it traces the postmodern elements of the social justice theory. Social justice theory can be understood as critical theory from the Frankfurt School as it evolved through time, plus certain aspects of postmodern theory getting tacked onto it. And so in that book, we trace, because so many philosophers decided to tell us that postmodernism is dead, and it so clearly isn't, we decided to trace the history of postmodern ideas from the postmodernists themselves through a series of changes that happened in the 1980s and 1990, really around 1989. Like if you had to really pick magic years where stuff happened, the magic years are 1968, 1989. And they're like, stuff got weird around 2011. And so those are sort of like your magic years where everything kind of shifted. And so we trace that intellectual history and show how a very consistent theme of postmodern thought has progressed from its origins in French philosophy in the 1960s through today, but it's mutated. It mutated once in the 90s very significantly, and then it's mutated again in the last decade or so. And that's where it's really become properly religious. It's ceased to be so much social activism and started to become properly religious in orientation, starting probably around 2010.
Okay. Well, that sounds good. I'm looking forward to that. Anything else that we should plug? Well, I got you.
Well, I mean, the encyclopedia is always worth talking about. Have you seen the encyclopedia?
No.
Okay. On New Discourses, that's my website. So newdiscourses.com. If you look at the top bar, there's a selection, and one of the options is Social Justice Encyclopedia. I called the thing Translations from the Wokish, so we can go full circle to my Tolkien nerd. That is a Tolkien reference. And what I am trying to do is to write a relatively accessible explanation of the way that critical social justice as an ideology uses language. A lot of people will have noticed that they use words in a funny way. Like they say we need diversity, and then the thing that they call diversity doesn't seem to really be diversity.
Yeah. In a box.
But they aren't. It's really hard to put your finger on how it's different. So I'm writing this encyclopedia to put your finger on every single one of those things. So it's meant to show what each one of those, as many different words as possible, actually mean the way they use them, with excerpts from their literature to prove it, and how those ideas relate to one another to create a coherent system of thought that I would tell you is as well developed as was Christianity leading up to the Nicene Council. I mean, this is a well-developed system of thought that has its own worldview, its own everything. And so I'm trying to lay that out in an encyclopedia format with lots of cross-reference links. I've got about 120 or so terms explained. I started at Christmas to give you an idea of that. So we're talking like 210,000 words of writing and coalition or collating, I guess, together since Christmas is what I've done on that damn thing. So it's pretty intense. So if you want to understand what diversity means, or if you end up in an online argument about diversity and somebody's like, we need more diversity, and you're like, do you know what that means? It means blah, 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 blah. You don't have to write your long paragraph explaining it. Boom, just put a link. And so that's awesome. The idea. You can go read it and learn it for yourself, so you're more equipped to get into these discussions. And then you can also just drop the link every time the term comes up, so that whoever else is in the thread has access. They can learn what the term means. My goal isn't actually to destroy critical social justice. I think that would pollute my endeavor. I want it destroyed, but my goal is not to destroy it. My goal is merely to show people what it is. I think it destroys itself. And so I want to show people what it is and let free, fair-minded people make up their own minds, but make it up understanding what the thing is. Kind of like, it's not quite as noble, I guess, but there's a big problem 100 and some odd years ago where like dairies were putting milk, like paint and water in the milk and watering it down. It's like if people knew they were buying paint water, they wouldn't have been buying it, and the free market would have solved the problem.
Right.
But it actually took the ability to verify that what's in the jug is milk had to come along. So now I'm trying to, like, this jug actually has milk that has watered down chalk and paint And so, buy which one you want is sort of what I would be saying. Like, this is what a jug full of industrial solvent looks like. Do you really want a jug of industrial solvent to try to make society better? No, I don't think you do either, but that's up to you. And so I'm trying to expose what critical social justice actually is, explain it on its own terms, and then compare it against the alternatives that it's parasitizing off of, which would be liberal ethics and values, meaning in the philosophical sense, not left-wing politics in the United States sense.
Right. Yeah. Real corruption of terms going on there. So
Yeah.
It's good work you're doing. Really appreciate it. I love your dedication to the mission, and I hope it doesn't drive you crazy.
Me too.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me for this. This was a great conversation. Really appreciate it.
I appreciate it too.